Well, here we are again. We are still in the Middle Ages, the medieval period, and at this point now in the semester, we have reached the Middle Ages, which is the Romanesque period. This name means in the spirit of Roman art. Now, for the Romanesque period, the context of the art is really important. Maybe even more important than other periods of art production that we've been studying so far in this semester. There's a really clear correlation between the art that's being produced and the political, the economic, and the demographic shifts that are going on in Europe at the turn of the millennium. So we are looking at the 11th and the 12th centuries when we're looking at this time period. Now, there's two things that we want to think about when we're thinking about the Romanesque period in terms of what's going on during this time. Now, one thing that we are seeing during this time is we are seeing the decline of the feudal system. Feudal system was the dominant economic system in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, and at this point it's in decline. Now, the sort of gist of the feudal system is this idea of a very disproportionate amount of wealth being held by a very small amount of people. So few people ridiculously wealthy, and everyone else, people like you and me, living in abject poverty, really just trying to make ends meet and struggling to do so. Now, what happened was a couple things. Okay, first, what we see is we see a decline in labor availability. So the way the feudal system worked is you would have these really rich people who were also landowners. They own the majority of the land in Europe, and what they would do is they would pay people to work the land, and of course they did not pay them living wages, and by exploiting their labor it allowed the rich to get richer. There was so many people that were needing work, they were needing ways to sustain themselves, that people would take anything that they could to make a living, even if it meant taking a wage that would not be effective to live off of. And the idea was if you were getting paid too little, you could go to your landowner and say, I really need more money. And that person could say, well, you know what? I've got 10 other people that want to take your job, so bye. So the rich are getting richer, there's all this labor, and they really can pay people small amounts of money. Now what happens is during this time in the turn of the millennium, there's a series of plagues that sweep Europe. Now this isn't the Black Plague that everybody is so familiar with. That one doesn't occur until the pre-Renaissance. But there are enough diseases and health issues that it does cause somewhat of a reduction in the population. With this population reduction, all of a sudden that shortage of labor goes away. And so what happens is now when people go to the landowner and they say, oh, I need you to pay me more, there's not 10 more people waiting to take the job. And people began to realize now that they had a level of economic power and labor power, because it wasn't like the landowner could just go off and work the land himself. He had so much land that the landowner was beholden to these people. He had to pay the higher wages or else his crops would die, he would lose, loads of money. And so you can see how it kind of equalizes things, where now people are making higher wages, the wealth is being sent back down and distributed among people a little bit more equitably. So that was one thing that undermined the feudal system. Other thing that undermined the feudal system, and this is really important, particularly for the architecture of the time period, is that we have the emergence of the craft industry. The emergence of the craft industry, think of like a really old, a really basic concept of like a factory, and maybe these are like the first pre-industrial factories. And so, for example, let's say there's these people that want to make shoes, and so the idea is you could go and you could get this job where you're like the person who sews the soles on the bottom of the shoe, and that's all you do. So you sit there all day, you sew the soles on the shoes, pass it to the next person who their job is laces. It kind of goes like that. The point is this provides another economic opportunity for people. So if your landowner is not paying you enough money, bye, I'm going to the city where I can now work in a craft industry. And so that also made it harder for landowners to have cheap labor to work all of their land. Now, what's really important is with the craft industries, what this is contributing to, in addition to the decline of feudalism, is the rise of the city. This is where we see the true large cities in Europe beginning to emerge during this time. And we're going to talk more about the implications of this when we get to the next slide. Now, really quickly, this idea of the Romanesque period, okay? In the spirit of Roman art, I personally feel like whoever art historian came up with this idea did nobody any favors. This is, I think, a really confusing style because you're thinking, oh, in the spirit of Roman art, I'm going to see all these pediments and all these columns and all these entablatures. No, it's a little bit more of an oblique reference to what the Romans were doing. I'm going to try really hard to point out the references to Rome, but otherwise this is just an approach that is very varied in the style, and we certainly will be seeing that. All right, now let's get back to this idea of the rise of the city. Now, as you can imagine, these cities are getting larger and larger and larger. And so what happens in terms of church architecture is this necessitates the construction of larger churches to accommodate this growing population. The other thing, think about, is all these people are moving to the cities. This is going to stimulate the economy, and this is going to allow for the cities to have more money to invest in churches and things like this. Now, the other thing that contributes to the increasing size of the church during the Romanesque period is that during this time we also have the rise of the pilgrimage. So this is when people are taking all of these religious journeys, and they're doing so for spiritual reasons, oftentimes for like healing purposes and that sort of thing. So people go all around traveling, and then these pilgrimages would terminate at these churches that would have really significant relics. And a relic essentially is a holy object. We'll talk more about these at the end of this lecture. They would look at these relics, and it would provide this desired sense of healing or spiritual sustenance or whatever it is that people are seeking. This structure that you see on the screen, this was the largest pilgrimage church in all of Europe at the time, and it had some pretty superstar relics. It had a piece of the true cross, which is a piece of the cross that Jesus was crucified on. That's a pretty legit relic. This church today does not have that relic any longer. It was removed sometime during the Reformation, around, I believe, the 17th century, and now there's just a collection of more minor relics that are situated within this church. Okay, so now let's talk about how all of this plays out architecturally, okay? So what's going on is, if you look at this slide, you can see that there's a lot of architectural features that at this point are pretty standard within Christian church architecture. What's important to note is there's some new additions, and this is where we're getting into this idea of increasing the church in terms of size, but there's also a component of this that fits in with the Romanesque style that we want to keep in mind, okay? Now, here's the nave, right? We know all about the nave. This is the central area where people sit, and typically what we would have is we would have side aisles, okay, one on each side. Now, what we're seeing in the Romanesque period is the addition of an additional side aisle. So now we've got 2 side aisles on each side, creating a total of 4. Now, this is important for 2 reasons. You know what the aisles are used for. They're allowing people to walk around without disturbing the activity in the nave. So with additional aisles, it's simply accommodating more people because people are coming in to visit the relics and such, and so they need to be able to move around without disturbing prayer in the nave. Now, what this also does, and this is the part that refers to the Romanesque style, is it creates a more wider structure. One of the things that is typical of Romanesque architecture is that it's wide, it's low and wide. And this is a difference that we see with Gothic architecture, which is the period that we're going to study next lecture, where they're more focusing on the structures being thin and tall. So short and wide is more typically a Romanesque approach. Now, what we also have here is we have the transept, right? This perpendicular arm to the nave. Now, we know that the transept is not something brand new, never been seen before. In Old St. Peter's, which was that large church that was commissioned by Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, we see the inclusion of a transept. But remember, the transept, even though it appears in Old St. Peter's, is not typically a regular feature of church architecture until now, until the Romanesque period. Now all of a sudden we've got these transepts that are being added in. Why all of a sudden do transepts appear? Well, do you remember the function of the transept? The function is whatever, right? Whatever people want to use it for. And so basically it's increasing the space of the interior, and they're using it to seat people if they run out of room in the nave. But more frequently what we're seeing is these are the spaces where they'll store the relics. And this is where people will go and walk around and check out the holy objects in this area here. Now the apse, we're familiar with that. That is standard where the altar is located. Now what's new is the incorporation of the ambulatory. Now the ambulatory, this was something that was typically found in centrally planned structures. So what's new is they're now adding this to the Latin cross and basilica plans. So they're expanding the ambulatory so it's appearing in all three of the plans that we talk about in this class. Now we know the ambulatory allows people to walk around, similar in function to the aisles. So people are walking around behind the apse. Now the other thing that we start to see appearing more frequently are these side or radiating chapels. They're called radiating because they extend out of the wall. These particular ones are located at the back of the ambulatory, but it's very common to see side or radiating chapels along the outer aisle as well. So there's not really like a set location for these. Now the placement of these radiating chapels here is very interesting, and I chose this because it shows a good example of why these are starting to be appearing in church architecture. So these churches are humongous. They are very, very expensive to build, and even though we have these cities that are getting very wealthy and they have a growing economy, it's still not enough money to fund and to upkeep such large structures. And so what they would have to do is they would have to engage in revenue generating practices. So how can we raise extra money? What they would do is they would sell or rent out these radiating chapels to wealthy families in the city. And then they could use these chapels as their private place of worship. Now think about how this would be advantageous for a wealthy family in terms of communicating status and power to the rest of the city. So you and I were everyday people. We're in this church. We're facing the nave, right? We're in the nave facing the apse and, watching the religious service. So as we sit in the nave, as we're oriented to the apse, what do we see directly behind? Oh, we see all these radiating chapels with wealthy, powerful people that get the best seat in the whole house directly behind the apse. So it's that kind of like idea of VIP seating that we were talking about when we were studying the Islamic mosque, right? Remember the Maqsura is the same idea. And so it's a way to show power and privilege because they sit so close to the altar. The other thing that they would do very frequently is the more high-ranking of these wealthy families would often be buried in the floor of the radiating chapel. This was also kind of a status sort of situation because there was a belief during this time that this was kind of like a free ticket into heaven. If you are buried in a significant location, like, I don't know, the largest pilgrimage church in all of Romanesque Europe, that's going to send you straight to heaven. So you could be a complete jerk in this life, doing whatever you feel like, and that doesn't matter because you just get to go to heaven because you're buried at in a significant place. Now, obviously, this isn't going to sit well with people, and it's this kind of shenanigans that are going to eventually lead to the Reformation, the splitting of Christendom. Now, we don't talk about this in this class. This is something that we save for Art 201, but I mention it because it's this idea that some discontent regarding the church practices is already sort of, rumbling as early as the Romanesque period. Let's move on. All right, now we're going to move up to Norway. So we're looking at the Scandinavian region, Northern Europe, and we're looking at a Borgund stave church. Now, here we have the Norwegians, okay? They're kind of well known as the Vikings, And we've talked to think about the Vikings a little bit when we were looking at the early Middle Ages and this idea of these people who are seafarers. And so they have these boats, and these boats are so prominent in their culture. And they begin to create these boats not only for trade, but for shenanigans, right? Going out and taking over places, but also for exploration. And we know that they even buried high-ranking dead in their ship burials. So the takeaway here is that with the prominence of the ship in Norwegian culture, that they're super accomplished woodworkers, and we're clearly seeing that here. Now, material is something to keep in mind too, because it's not just simply a reference to their cultural practices, but also as speaking to availability, and that we're not having an abundance of stone that's in this area, and so they're using the materials that they have. So the Borg and stave churches, they're just very distinct, not only in terms of design, but in terms of material, from their stone counterparts in the southern areas of Europe. Okay, so let's talk about this. So we start to see the Vikings and other Norwegian cultures beginning to slowly start to convert to Christianity around the year 600. And of course, this is a more slow-going process. And so once they convert to Christianity, this creates this need for them to build these church structures. So what they do is they kind of, and I think this is really beautiful in a way, this idea of really keeping a lot of their indigenous cultural practices, but integrating it with this new religion that people are beginning to embrace. Now, how they're doing this here is they're integrating their great halls with a basilica structure. So what they would do is they would have these towns, and at the center of the town is the Great Hall, which was a very large wooden rectangular structure that had a myriad of functions. It had primarily like a political function where like the leader of the city and the administrators and stuff would meet. There was a social function where people would gather and things like that. Sometimes there would maybe not often be some sort of tangential religious goings on there as well, primarily though an economic and a political space. So basically what they do is they take this large great hall, rectangle, and then they just throw an apse in the back, which is right in here. Ignore that little thing, quit doing that. There's your apse right in there, as you can see. And add an apse, now you've got a basilica. So what we also see that is typical for the Norwegians is, if you look up here, these are dragons. Why do you think they would have dragons on the top of their structures? Well, if you're thinking about this idea of protection, you would be correct. It's this idea of protection, and it's this idea that these animals are scary and they're fantasy, and so that makes them beyond, our understanding and our rational experiences, and that makes us nervous, etc. It's the same kind of situation as the gargoyles, which those are those like creepy monster beings that they put on top of Christian churches, particularly from the Gothic period. Now, these churches, they're called stave churches. They're made entirely out of wood. There's nothing at all that's metal except for a little bit of the door fixtures, and then there's some stone embellishment in an interlace pattern that tends to be placed on the doors as well. So they have these staves, which are these thick wooden posts that are used to hold the church upright. Now, what they would do is they would locate these in specific positions. They would put them in elevated places because they were believed to be really special, beautiful areas that kind of conveyed the handprint of God. Now, also probably not a coincidence, when you elevate them, it makes them increasingly visible, which probably is communicating the power and the dominance of the religion. Also, since we're talking about coincidences, many of these churches were built on pre-existing sites that were pagan temples. This is very, very typical when you have a new religion that becomes dominant to deconstruct or sort of build over the earlier religious spaces. And that we see that the Norwegians are certainly doing this as well. There are not many of these left. This is probably the best preserved out of 26 of them. Obviously, wood does not stand the test of time. So that is something that has affected the number that we have. And unfortunately, in the 90s, there was this sort of protest that was being encouraged by black metal music, which originates from this region. And in protest of Christianity taking away their history, they felt, they went ahead and burned down these old churches from the Romanesque period, which I guess they didn't think that was part of their history either, even though it did incorporate indigenous forms. So that's someone, I guess, not really thinking things through and just taking upon themselves to burn down an incredible work of architecture that's now lost forever. Let's move on. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sculpture. We're still at a place where there's not a ton of sculpture. We're still seeing people fairly squeamish about this idea of creating sculpture in the round, the sphere that encourages people to worship false idols. But we do see some examples of small-scale sculpture in the form of luxury arts. And these are works of art that are made primarily by nuns or by monks, and they're made for display in the church. And so that makes people feel a little bit better. Now, in terms of the Romanesque sculptural style, we want to think about influence. There is a style that is super influential to the Romanesque style. And I'd like, if you could, to pause the video and think about this. Look carefully at what you see and maybe go through your notes and see if you can figure out what style this is influenced by. It's very clear influence. So hopefully you did that. And hopefully what you concluded is that the Romanesque style is very much influenced by the Byzantine period. Yes, this is essentially a three-dimensional rearticulation of a Byzantine icon. Every single thing, right? So first of all, we've got the throne or seat of wisdom, right? Which is a very, very prevalent theme in the Byzantine period, where we have homunculus man baby Jesus who sits on the lap of Mary. She's serving as his throne. We've got that. We've got the stiff and frontal positioning. We've got a lack of emotion. We have a stylized treatment of drapery. We have weird long hands. Look at that. Super weird, right? I think that's all I'm seeing here, right? We're just missing the gold, obviously, but that's okay. This is a sculpture, so probably not something that we would expect. But what I want you to see is that basically we're seeing the Byzantine style in full effect in the Romanesque period. Okay, and now we're talking about reliquaries. So we were talking about this idea of relics, of holy objects that people would come to and see at these churches as part of a pilgrimage. Now, it's not like you would just walk in and a piece of the true cross is just sitting on the table. They would house these in reliquaries. So reliquary is like a container for a relic, and it helps to protect it. And then you just have trust and faith that what they say is in there is actually located in. Now, most reliquaries actually are body parts. And what they'll do is they'll take the body part and then they'll make a reliquary that is in the shape of the body part so people know what they're looking at. So any guesses as what you think is the relic contained in the head reliquary of St. Alexander? Yeah, a piece of the skull, a piece of the skull. So we've got the head. Now, a couple things, okay? First of all, this is one of those more oblique references to the Romanesque period. What we see is when artists historians say, and I'm inclined to agree, what looks like a clear influence coming from the head of Constantine in the late Empire period. Now, this makes sense because don't forget, Constantine is a superstar of the Middle Ages, so people are super on board with replicating this style. And it's just this idea that he's young, he's kind of generic, he sort of stares off into space. Even the hair is kind of similar in the way that it's stylized. So people see stylistically that there is a connection there. The other thing we want to note is we want to note material. So we've got really beautiful fine materials. Gold, silver, semi-precious stone. The idea was the fancier the material, the more significant it made the relic. And so it actually was something that would be advantageous for churches to sort of pay to have super fancy reliquaries made, because if they had kind of a minor whatever relic, this could kind of up its status and encourage people to come, to give donations to the church, to visit, and all of those things. We do still see a Byzantine influence. We see it with the gold clearly, but even up in here, and these are these more, they're kind of like Byzantine icons. Here we've got our dragons, our scary little animals that are functioning to protect this piece of a head that's in this reliquary. All right, and we have now the Bayeux Tapestry. And what I'm doing right now when I say Bayeux Tapestry is I'm making those like quote marks with my finger. This is not at all the right title. First of all, this is not a tapestry. It's embroidery. So a tapestry is where you weave in the fabric together, and an embroidery is where you sew it on. So this tapestry, quote marks with my fingers, this tapestry is linen that it's linen with wool thread sewn in. Okay. Now, also this idea of Bayeux is referring to the cathedral that the Bayeux Tapestry is in. But we have no idea if that was the intended location for this tapestry. So the takeaway here, there's a really good chance this title's completely wrong. Now, what keeps me, though, sleeping well at night is that I think in your textbook, at least Marilyn Stockstad refers to this as an embroidery. Thank you, Stockstad. So the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, the Bayeux Tapestry, it's a pretty important work of art. So this work of art is commemorating the rise of William the Conqueror to power. And he was a Norman, okay? So he came from Normandy, Northern Europe, Vikings, sort of all of that situation. In fact, he was, for all those of you who watched the show The Vikings, which I'm pretty on board with that show because I think it's relatively historically accurate. I don't watch it anymore, but when I had out my phone the whole time checking, and everything seemed to be above board in terms of accuracy. Anyways, the brother of the main character, Rollo, the guy with long hair that always walks around with no shirt on, Rollo is an ancestor, supposedly, of William the Conqueror. The point is, I'm totally getting off track here, sorry. The point is that William the Conqueror comes in, and you know what he does? He's conquering. And so he comes in and he unites England and France under one rule. And this happens in the year 1066. So what happens is the women of the Norman court, they create this embroidery. And what this does is it's talking about the events that led up to and that happened while, and then what happened after William the Conqueror is conquering. So what's interesting about this is it's all happening in one composition. It's something like 24 inches is the height. The width, 224 feet long. This is epic to say the least. This is a huge tapestry. And it's all one continuous image where the images of these different events transition one into the next. Why is this ringing a bell to me? Why do I feel like we've heard this before? This idea of this really long compositional space, all of the events in there. What does that remind you of? I don't know about you, but it sure makes me think of Trajan's column. Here we see a work of art that is evidencing influence from Trajan's column. Same idea, the continuous narrative. Now we're just going to look at one image. This is the funeral procession to Westminster Abbey, and this is a scene that happens before William the Conqueror comes into power. So at this time in the narrative, we see this funeral procession. Now, one of the things helpful is there's a little bit of level of consistency. So the consistency is at the top and bottom registers where we see these animals. Most of them are animals of fantasy, but there's some real animals in there as well. Very common subject matter in medieval art across the board is this idea of animals, particularly animals of fantasy. So that kind of like unifies the tapestry across its 224 feet. The other thing, we have some text, very helpful, thank you, to let us know what's going on. Here we go, Edward I, king, right? So we're seeing the funeral procession. Here he is right here. He has passed away, and we see that his casket's being conveyed here to carry it to this church where the hand of God is taking time out of his very busy God schedule to point down from the sky and say, this is where I would prefer for you to bury Edward I in the Westminster Abbey. Now, the Westminster Abbey, this is actually why I chose this image out of all of them to show you, because Westminster Abbey is a super important structure in the Romanesque period. It was one of the first Romanesque structures in England, and the women of the Norman court were very proud of this structure, and they took very great care to depict the architectural features of this structure as accurately as possible. Now, if you go to London today, it will not look the way that you see here in the Bayeux Tapestry. This is because over the years since its construction, it's undergone frequent renovations and additions. Part of what has encouraged the renovations and additions to this structure is this tradition of burying really significant people in this church. And there are super significant people. I think like almost all of the English monarchy is buried in there, except for Henry VIII. He's actually not buried in there. But Elizabeth I, who's like the bossest queen ever, she's in there. Mary I, her sister, is buried in there. All sorts of great people. And we also know now Edward I is buried in there as well. Now, there's another reason why Westminster Abbey is so significant. I think this church and its inclusion in this area of the tapestry functions as sort of a foreshadowing. And so what happens is when William the Conqueror becomes king, the coronation, the crowning of this takes place at the Westminster Abbey. The reason why this is significant is he's the first monarch that's ever been crowned at the Westminster Abbey, and every single monarch since has been crowned there. I think within our lifetimes, we're going to see a shift of power in England, the monarchy. And when we have the crowning of a new monarch, probably it's going to be Prince Philip, that will take place in this structure. And when you see this happening, you can think back and remember fondly art history and all that you know about the Westminster Abbey based from the Bayeux Tapestry. This concludes our short lecture on the Romanesque period. You will be watching, if you have not yet, your Gothic and Romanesque architecture for a little bit more of a filling in on the structures it produced during this complicated but yet vibrant period of art production.